Okay. Alrighty, welcome back, welcome back. Today we are going to figure out what's going on with predictive processing as per the calendar. This is kind of tough. See, I was thinking that we would switch these around, but maybe we don't. The issue is that when I'm typing something here, no one can see it. That's an unfortunate quality of this. I don't know. We'll figure that one out. All right, I want to make some notes here. Just kind of what I want to talk about what we know. Things that we know. What do we know about predictive processing? Yo, I just reopened Twitch and I appeared. All right, let's go even bigger. Let's go bigger, better. What do we know? What do we know? Welcome home, son. Nice. Thank you, thank you. I've got stream clips, stream videos edited and ready to go. I think one's releasing tomorrow morning, one's releasing Thursday, and then I worked on one today that I guess I'll set to release, I don't know, next Tuesday. Maybe we should just create like a, you know, a two a week schedule and just kind of push those as forward as we could go. But we'll see. Because ideally at some point I start making clips from these videos, just assuming that people aren't going to see it from the videos. We'll see. All right, what do we know? What do we know? What do we know? Predictive processing is an interpretation of neural processes, of processes in the brain. We call it predictive. Predictive. Actually, I'll just do. So I wanted to do this where I didn't just go straight to Gemini. I want to kind of write all the things down first, and then we could go to Gemini just to test it out. Oh, another thing that everyone might be stoked about. Nice, look at that. We've got. I did add some instructions. We can edit these or whatnot, but I'm looking for accuracy and comprehension. I care more about learning what's correct than I care about how I feel about it. I prefer clarity over pleasantries and flattery, and I appreciate honest feedback, even if critical. I'm comfortable with pushback when my ideas lack rigor. Overall, I'm interested in what I am allowed to think, believe, say, given logic/evidence and contemporary consensus. All right. So, yeah, we hopefully that works, and then we could always update it. One of the things that I might want to do is specifically look at more prompts like that and just see what people are doing. Which ones do I like or stand out to me? Still quite hot. All right, we call it predictive because we see that top-down signals what's the best way to say this? They don't affect. They affect the trajectory of our processing. interface with bottom up signals and influence the outcome. Let's just say that. But that it's not just that, right? Because A and B, perhaps more importantly, these top-down signals can cause the same outcomes even when bottom-up signals, when the usual bottom-up signals aren't present, right? That's the whole reason why we would say it's predictive. For example, causing the feeling of increased heart rate before the heart even starts speeding up. This occurs, this interpretation covers multiple levels of abstraction in the brain. At the broadest sense, we can make sense of, in the broadest sense, we can make sense of how the brain sees things that aren't there. Actually, no, that's actually not, I wouldn't say that's the broadest sense here. We can intuitively see that we can predict things that happen. Actually, you know what? I want to actually push back on that. The idea that we predict things that happen in the future, I don't think is as fundamentally predictive processing as we'd think, which kind of we have to separate in a sense. What we are curious about, what we are curious about. What are we curious about? Is the fact that we can predict things, concrete outcomes / possibilities, as well as consider the very concept of possibilities and potential unknowns. A direct manifestation of predictive processing? Or would that be somewhat inappropriate, given that our conscious experience is distributed across the brain? And while predictive processing affects all these networks, it doesn't like create predictions in our mind. It isn't, okay, I should say it isn't directly responsible for the predictions in our that manifest in our conscious minds. We can perhaps make more sense of those thoughts through a more comprehensive view of pattern recognition, so memory, pattern recognition, linguistics, etc. All right, we can intuitively see that we can predict. Okay, I could get rid of that one. The other thing I want to know is how what does predictive processing actually entail regarding how we ought to think / talk about the brain, neural signals, neural processing, top-down versus bottom-up signals, etc. In some sense, it seems as though top-down signals have first authority on what we experience. So this leads neuroscientists to describe our conscious experience as controlled hallucinations. That said, our bottom-up signals significantly affect, shape our conscious experience over time. While there is no interpretation without top-down priors, we can still consider how much we can we must still consider how much we can attribute our conscious experience of tangible things in our view as representing the physical world. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Like when I see a pen, like, you know, there's a lot, obviously that experience I always talk about, it's completely subjective. There's affect involved. There's this experience of this thing feeling true. This thing feels like it's right here. It's in front of me. It's in the room. It's something I can grab and do stuff with. It's got properties. It's related to other things, and it's true in the sense that if I wasn't even here, that this thing would still be a pen. That said, we've got this, you know, how much of that is coming from my priors, my culturally contingent understanding, and how much is that coming from the fact that there's photons hitting my eyes. And this might become a conversation on embodied cognition, like, really quickly. All right, so what was the other thing I wanted to say? Is it, okay, this interpretation covers multiple, in the broadest sense, we can make sense of how the brain sees things that aren't there. Predictive processing is pervasive across, I should say seems to be pervasive across brain regions and networks. And at the most granular scale, we can see that individual neurons via dendritic logic circuits. Leverage top-down priors entering the dendrite closer to the axon hillock. Am I going crazy? Oh yeah, dendrite. Leverage top-down priors when processing bottom-up signals entering farther away. That's some individual neurons. All right, this is the pyramidal neurons. I forget. Did I save this video? Because I think it's worth watching again. Do I have a history? History. I would have watched this earlier today. Yes.
That have satisfying.
Maybe less than all we could be aware of, right? And so
a lot of really brilliant insights have been required to get us to the point we're at now.
Okay. This stuff is so interesting. It's crazy.
As someone in a hospital, or
the only reason I got back to this video is because I was editing a short that was me watching this video the last time. So
I sitting here having this conversation, and that's what we're really excited about, is this ability to essentially take something that seems so ineffable, right, our conversation, and build it up from a biological basis.
And to see if I can kind of understand it, it's interesting that you kind of say there actually is this need for the expectations from ourselves, and the sensory input seems kind of actually important for consciousness, such that, if you block, you can still have the expectations maybe, if there's a sensory input, what can you do? And equally, if there's sensory input, but then you're not really able to make sense of that and think, well, would you, kind of expect to see how should I be interpreting what the sensory information? Then there seems to be kind of no consciousness. So, and then what you're doing is kind of, if we can actually look at, okay, that's like an important thing, and then what more generally is going, a broader scale is going on in the brain, and then what more can that tell us about consciousness, if we can kind of model that, and then we're sort of seeing what dynamics more broadly are important for facilitating consciousness. So, tell me a bit more about your work there.
Yeah, so it's important to state at this stage that this idea of expectation and evidence matching leading to consciousness is not a new idea. That's been around for some time, and there's some really beautiful work. Victor Lama had some really lovely work on this that I read back when I was a grad student. That was quite inspirational to me. But again, and Matthew had also done a lot of work to that end before we came along. The part that we're trying to add to this sort of very complex puzzle is taking very seriously this notion of sort of the organization of the brain being particularly useful for some of the things that we're capable of doing. And so if you look at this notion of these cells that can integrate your expectations with the evidence that comes in, it turns out that they're connected, and that coupling between these two compartments is influenced and kind of modulated by a number of other structures that have also been shown by others to be deeply important for consciousness. So one of them is the thalamus, which is a really deep structure in the brain, which we're really interested in. And then the other one is known as the reticular activating system, or it's part of what's called the brainstem. So these structures are much, much deeper in the brain than the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is kind of a central processing hub, and then the brainstem is kind of the core, really deep kind of in your neck that supports many really basic physiological functions.
And we saw that the thalamus was really important for the global workspace theory, and the brainstem was really important for Damasio's view. And then we discussed what happens when either of those are damaged in our last video on consciousness.
So there's parts of your brainstem that control your heart rate and control your breathing rate and your ability to balance. It also has the highways that send all the messages from your body up to your brain and your brain back down to your body. So anything that comes in or goes out has to go through the brainstem. But interspersed in amongst all of those different circuits are this really interesting set of regions, different nuclei, neurons, that project really diffusely up into the brain. And in particular, they actually are projected to areas that help this coupling turn on or off. And so we're really interested in whether or not different elements of this system could actually facilitate different types of emergent activity in a system that was built of these little toys. So you can imagine this a little bit like playing with Lego and setting the puzzle, the Lego piece to be this particular neuron that can couple things together and do this interesting burst firing. What we're essentially doing is saying, what if we built a model like that versus the way that people would traditionally build models, which is just that each neuron sums up all of its inputs and then does a little spike. That's called an integrate and fire neuron. We've got a different type of a sort of Lego block at the start. And the question is, can that do really interesting things? Can that compute in different ways? Can that
So it's not just integrate and then fire. That's like the idea that there's just signals coming in. Some of them excite, some of them inhibit, and whatever happens, they just kind of all clash. And whatever's, it's imagine you're like pouring one thing in and then you're pouring another thing, and whatever happens is whether or not the neuron fires. But this is showing that there's actually inputs that are both inhibitory and excitatory, coming from bottom up signals and then coming from priors, so top down priors. And when these things are in line in certain ways, there's specific outcomes that he discusses.
Provide different types of kind of computational signatures. And it turns out that it can do lots of very interesting things that are coincident with predictions that people have made in the community from a completely different perspective, thinking about what would be the benefit of being conscious versus not, or what would the mechanism of a conscious thought versus an unconscious thought be. And we can kind of find some of those signatures using our model in a way that we find really, really exciting.
It's interesting that one often thinks about consciousness and the higher order capacities of God and this there neurons and why would you think about it like this?
Yeah, it's a tricky one to get into on a general podcast, but we'll do our best. A lot of really brilliant insights have been required to get us to the point we're at now in computational neuroscience, and I don't have time to cover the sort of full history, but one of the really huge insights that really helped computational neuroscientists was this notion that you could take the complexity of a neuron. If you looked at one of these things under a microscope, you'd feel like you were kind of walking through the forest looking at an individual tree and trying to describe it. And neurons have very characteristic components to them. They have a cell body. They have a projection that leaves the cell body, which we call an axon, which is often thought to be the kind of output of the cell. And they've got a set of what we call dendrites, which are the kind of receptive parts of the cell. And neurons come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them are very simple. So the cell body is covered in little dendrites that look like little hairs, and the output of an axon is a single axon. But some of them are deeply complex and have this really, really intricate architectures. But irrespective of all that complexity, one insight that people had many, many, many years ago was that you could treat the neuron a little bit like it was a little summing potential. So that what it's basically doing is the cell body's waiting around and saying, based on all the dendritic inputs that I'm getting from other neurons, if I just sum all of them up, and within a given window of time, which you can set as a computational scientist, if the number of inputs that came in was above a certain threshold, which again you define, I'm going to do an output, which will be a little spike, which from measuring them we know is the kind of a common thing that these neurons do. And so this was called an integrate and fire neuron because you're integrating inputs and then firing. And it turns out that if you make that assumption, you can recapitulate a lot of really important features of a neuron's, or a sort of canonical neuron's behavior with really, really simple mathematics that can then be scaled up. The reason that we wanted to get away from that a little bit was inspired by Matthew's work, which shows that this particular neuron, which is the main output of the cerebral cortex, it's a deep neuron with a really, really, really long, elaborated dendritic tree. It turns out that they don't behave as though they are perfectly integrated and fire neurons, because if there are inputs that come to their dendritic tree, those inputs actually have to traverse this incredibly long path all the way down to the cell body before they can have an impact. And it turns out that the brain has actually developed a number of really intricate mechanisms for determining whether or not that particular input can get propagated to actually have an impact on the cell body. So it's a little bit like saying, rather than being an integrate and fire, it's the integrate part is now much, much more complex. It's much more nuanced and it's context dependent. And it turns out that based on a bunch of empirical recordings, they can show that context dependency is deeply linked to both your state of consciousness, whether you're conscious of the world or not, but also your consciousness of contents, whether you're conscious of a particular thing happening. In this case, they were tweaking a whisker on a mouse and actually seeing whether or not the mouse would respond to that whisker tweak, and they can actually show that these this particular coupling, essentially whether or not the signal was integrated, right? Because that's now not a given. It could depend on whether or not there's a coupling between these compartments. Was actually deeply related to the animal's ability to respond. And so what that suggests is that we need to kind of soften this notion of integrated fire to be more context dependent, more nuanced. And then in doing so, we might actually determine or discover some of the kind of interesting quirks that brains have had to learn in order to support the complexity of our conscious experience as we're experiencing it right now.
Yeah, so
I think it's just scratching the surface. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I've been talking to some other neuroscientists. I guess it makes sense that neurons are actually incredibly complex. You know, even a single neuron. And so it's like, okay, well, how can we simplify this to model it, and then what can we explain? And it makes sense. So we can explain a lot if you have it, you know, almost this model where it sums and then fires. But you know, if it's kind of more complex, the way in which it chooses to sort of lead on to firing of other neurons and in this manner. I mean, as you say, I mean, would it make sense then because when we think about consciousness, it's interesting to link back to what we were saying. I mean, there could be sensory inputs, but then I do become consciously aware of it, right? That our attention and what we're conscious of maybe less than all we could be aware of, right? And so, you know, is in thinking about neurons and the brain in this way, does it help tell us about things, you know, we miss in consciousness and what comes into consciousness versus what doesn't? Is there a way to make sense of these kinds of things?
Yeah, I think so. We haven't done the kind of requisite experiments to kind of confidently state that just yet. But one of the ways that we have been sort of pushing into this domain a little is by trying to use the backbone that we've done. So let me take a step back. In the work that we've done so far, the challenge that we've set ourselves is if we build a little model of these neurons and their connections to the thalamus or their connections to the brainstem, and we build it at scale, can we then take the output of that system and match it to, let's say, a monkey that is asleep and then wakes up naturally? Can we differentiate those different sort of domains where we know that the monkey's unconscious and we know that it's conscious? That should differentiate in our model, and we can, and then we could do the same thing with a human who was given an anesthetic drug, and we would expect that the human's conscious zone should look a little bit like the monkey's awake zone, and the human's anesthetized zone should look a little bit more like the sleep zone. And they look really nice and very similar to one another, and then we can make inferences about what's happening. But again, here we're not trying to say anything about being conscious of a particular thing. It's just whether or not you were conscious or not. So it's more of what we call the intransitive use of the verb consciousness. To get at the more transitive use of the verb, which I think is probably the more interesting one for people when they're thinking about it. Like, I'm conscious of the words that I'm using right now to describe this to you, or we're conscious of this conversation. It's much more nuanced and complex. You need more sophisticated tasks. And to get at the kinds of things you were mentioning about the kind of whether or not you notice something in your environment is really challenging to invent tasks for that have satisfying behavioral readouts. One way that people have made, I think, really compelling progress in this space is by designing tasks that take advantage of interesting quirks in our conscious experience. So one of them uses something known as binocular rivalry. And this is a really, really interesting phenomenon where if you stare at an image, which the image is now being, different images are being presented to both eyes. So you can imagine something really, really boring, like a circle made of horizontal lines being fed to my left eye, and a circle of vertical lines being fed to my right eye. And imagine now I'm wearing little glasses so that one gets into one eye, one to the other, but there's no mixture. If you imagine that our perception is just a amalgamation of everything that comes into our eyes, you might imagine that what you see is a kind of blur, you know, something like crosshatch circles, right? It turns out that that's not what you experience. What you actually experience is the left stimulus and then the right stimulus and the left and the right, and it switches back and forth somewhat randomly over time. So that you don't. So the important point is that despite the input to your eyes being exactly matched, there's a completely different conscious experience. And so people have studied this for years and years and years. There's a bunch of different really interesting laws that you can come up with that determine whether or not.
I wonder if it's just ignition, and like just back and forth over and over again.
You'll see one of the items more or less, or they'll switch more frequently depending on how much.
And then also, obviously, this is very much affected by like top-down, which one you're trying to look for in some sense.
Much they overlap, depending how similar they are, etc. A really talented grad student in my lab, Chris White, actually was able to come up with a version of a model that used the same cellular constraints, the sort of breakdown in that integrated fire type model, and some features of the thalamus to actually recapitulate really, really realistic binocular rivalry dynamics. So you can basically make a model of this system, which we know is related to consciousness being turned on and off, and noticing a whisker twig in a mouse. You can now make it do this really, really rich psychological experiment, which any one of us could go and sit and put on glasses and have this experience happen for them. But now we can make really sophisticated predictions about what ought to be happening in the brain when you're conscious or not of a particular stimulus. You know, what causes the switch between you seeing the vertical grading and the horizontal grading? How can we speed it up and slow it down? And the reason we're excited by this is that this is sort of getting out ahead of the empirical science a little bit, because right now in the human brain, we don't have the ability to non-invasively record the human brain while people are performing this task at a sufficient level and precision to actually test these hypotheses in a human. And if we were to do it in a mouse, you can't at the moment ask a mouse whether or not it sees the
this is
stimulus
probably going to be the
left or
way
right.
to
You have
go.
actually use something like an operationalization, like the amount of firing in a particular population, to determine whether or not they were conscious. But that's almost sort of putting the problem to the side, right? And it's saying, you know, it's removing the subjective aspect of it in a way that we can easily ask a human. So we sort of imagine ourselves as sitting in this spot between really rich animal experiments, can do really precise recordings, and then really nuanced sort of psychological tasks, which are quite easy to do in a human, but very hard to do in an animal. And we're hoping that the computational models can sort of sit as a bridge between those two domains and create links.
Right.
I want to find what he said earlier about these anesthetics, because I just want to get that in here as something that I think is quite telling.
A number of years, some of the early studies, first recordings of humans that were undergoing neurosurgery, was that you could stimulate the brain with, let's say, a visual flash, and you could record from different parts of the brain, and they would be completely indistinguishable whether or not that person had been given an anesthetic, in other words, their consciousness had been removed, or if they were actually awake and perceiving the world. And then there'd be other parts of the brain where there'd be completely different responses. So you could imagine moving your probe from area 1 to area 2, and now all of a sudden you have a huge difference between whether the subject's actually awake and conscious and can respond to your every question or not. And it creates this really interesting challenge for scientists. You then say to yourselves, well, what is it about the brain that's changed? It was still structurally the same. We didn't remove any neurons or glia. We didn't change the blood flow to the brain at all.
Neurons are glia. Oh man, look at this guy.
Anesthetic drug, which has an interesting set of questions in how those work, but we can put that to the side. But you've given an anesthetic drug, and it's changed something. It's changed the ability for context to be brought to bear on responses. It's changed the ability for you to combine information together from your past experience, to bring that to bear on your response. And it's removed this kind of more robotic style of responding to the external world and given it a context dependency. And that's a really, really interesting capacity, and I think one that doesn't necessarily just vary in a kind of binary sense, like a light switch. It's not that you just have it or you don't. I think there's a big difference between being unconscious and conscious, but then once you're actually awake, this can actually vary to a large extent. And so you might compare, you know, a friend of yours who's a little bit more, let's say, concrete, and they really, everything they see, they just respond to, versus a friend that's very thoughtful, and every time you ask them a question, they have to think back to the past when they've had an experience that is a bit like that to give you some advice. And so these are now, you can imagine, a grade of different kinds of context dependency that are changing across individuals and maybe across the waking day. So there's a really interesting phenomena there, I think, to understand. And, you know, just as a kind of a curiosity-driven neuroscientist, it's really one of these big questions, like what is it about the way that our brains are organized that gives rise to this ability to sense the world and to experience anything at all? And then once you find out some of those clues, how far back could you track those structures? And then, you know, how far back should we be willing to give some of these same capacities to different animals? You know, when I interact with my dog or one of my dogs in my house, you know, are they conscious? Now, I think undeniably so, but then their brains are pretty similar to a cat, pretty similar to a rabbit, pretty similar to even things like reptiles, frogs, and fish and octopi. And so you start sort of pushing this thing back further and further, and you come up with these really, really interesting sort of insights, I think, into just how complex life is on our planet and how precious it is.
Right. I mean, on that point, it's interesting, and I'm gonna have some specific podcasts almost distinguishing between what do we mean by consciousness, right? So probably it seems, why wouldn't your dog be conscious? But then is there something to do with language? Like, is there kind of meta consciousness, which is something different? And it's I didn't realize that was a kind of problem, something we noticed. So there could be brain activity, you could stimulate it, but then no kind of conscious response. And so there are but then there are sometimes you can actually. And then that makes me think, so I remember I talked to Mark Soames and we talked a bit about anesthetics. So, okay, and so is that still something that needs to be explained? Like anesthetics work on parts of the brain and they can kind of turn off.
And he's getting the big names. This is crazy.
Everything. All
should I have been
completely shut off? It's so, and then
reaching out,
study that and be like, what actually are the specific things that are enabling and allowing consciousness?
I guess it helps that you have
fascinating and maybe
like a backlog of all these things.
Undergone surgery where you've been made unconscious with an anesthetic that we actually really still don't know.
This is quite inspiring.
Kind of central theory for exactly how different anesthetic agents work. And probably the leading theory is that they increase what's called inhibition in the brain. They increase the ability for brain signals to turn other brain neurons to turn other neurons' activity down. So you can imagine that a neuron could come in and affect another neuron and increase its activity. You can do the same thing in the other direction. And the idea is that anesthetics increase the likelihood that this inhibition will work. They're kind of a little bit like the librarians going around shushing everyone. If you have enough of them shushing in the library, no real conversations can happen between neurons. But it turns out that this is kind of problematic because there are other anesthetic drugs you can give that actually don't have a clear mechanism that increases the inhibition in the brain. My favorite example is actually the noble gas xenon is actually an anesthetic agent that works quite well. And if you remember your high school chemistry, noble gases are actually inert. They don't have any spare electrons that can interact with other chemicals. So they can't actually interact in the way that all the other kind of covalent or ionic bonds are made in chemistry. So there's something deeply mysterious about the site of action. So putting that to the side, though, there actually are some other ways that you can make progress here as neuroscientists. You can go through and you can say, irrespective of how an anesthetic agent works, whether or not it's xenon or one of these inhibition boosters or something altogether different, are there downstream effects that impact the nervous system in the same way? And from there, can we build up an understanding of what's different between conscious and unconscious? And so we were really inspired by some work done by a group in Germany. Matthew Larkham, who's actually an expat Australian working over in Germany at the Humboldt University. They have a really beautiful series of studies that have tracked back 15 to 20 years, showing that one of the main effects of anesthesia is to essentially decouple different compartments within cells in your cortex. So I'll unpack that a little for you.
To decouple compartments of cells. So this is multiple neurons? Or is this in the neuron?
The cortex is the kind of outer layer of the human brain. It's kind of the wrinkly outer part that you'll see if you Google the term brain online. It's quite convoluted sheet of these different cells that are all kind of interconnected with one another. And it turns out that within that convoluted sheet, if you were kind of to take a little biopsy of one part of it or sort of stick a microscope on one part, you'd see that a lot of the cells are actually oriented vertically. So that on the outside of the brain, the sort of, you can almost imagine the sort of upper part of a tree, the kind of bushy leaves of a tree are sitting at the top. And then there's these long stalks, a little bit like a palm tree, that go deep down into the brain. And just before the interface between the cortex and the rest of the brain, they have their what's called cell body. It's kind of like the roots of the tree. And it turns out it's really quite fascinating. These different parts of this cell, the top of the tree and the roots of the tree, receive completely different streams of input. So Matthew's actually shown that the kind of sensory inputs that you receive from the world, they're going to be much more likely to hit those bottom parts of the tree, whereas your expectations about what would happen actually project to the top parts of the tree.
So another thing that I like about just the way he's describing this is he says something like the bottom up signals are more likely to hit the farther away areas. So those types of qualifiers are really important. And they show, one, the messiness of this type of analog system, once again. And it also shows just how much he understands it in a way. Yo, Darmadon, what's good? We're back. This is trying to figure out exactly how we're allowed to talk about predictive processing, given the fact that I feel like I go overboard. So I want to see what we're actually allowed to say, you know. So I'm writing down what we know and why we would we use predictive processing as like a serious deal interpretive lens, and then what we're curious about. What is the contemporary consensus among people who take the predictive processing evidence seriously regarding its significance as a interpretive lens for the brain, as a pervasive interpretive lens for the brain. That's really what I want to know. Gonna make a coffee real quick. Hell yeah. Then we got normal day, chilling. Does consciousness defeat materialism? Whoa. I think it does, right? In a sense. But then it also doesn't in a sense. All right.
Those two parts interact, you actually get a really, really different effect in your brain. This big burst firing of this cell, it just goes absolutely bananas. And it,
So how do you talk about
expectations
that?
about what would happen actually project to the top parts of the tree. And when those two parts interact, you actually get a really, really different effect in your brain. This big burst firing of this cell, it just goes absolutely bananas. And it turns out that spiking that you see in the cell when these two streams interact actually coincides with your conscious experience of a stimulus. Now, I say your, but I mean here a mouse in an animal model of this perceptual.
Okay, okay. So this isn't. I think this is what this is saying. Is that the let's just say the logic gates within the dendrite architecture would effectively cancel out signals and have the two not connect. In the case of anesthesia, which he's going to talk about, he points out that anesthesia basically shuts off consciousness by inhibiting the connection of these two signals.
Experience. So what Matthew's done, which I think is really fascinating, is that he's shown that multiple different types of anesthetic drugs actually block the ability for that expectation and the evidence to match together.
Okay. Match together is a little more ambiguous. To block bottom up and top down signals from matching together, do they simply need to touch, or is there some sort of logic on how they interface that affects whether the neuron more likely undergoes a phase transition of excitability? Which results, so you stop the matching together,
and you basically block the ability for the cell to respond in that really big bursty way to those coincident inputs. And the reason this is really, really exciting is it suggests that irrespective of which anesthetic agent you use, a way to block an animal's ability to actually combine context with input actually can turn on and off conscious experience in a really physical way. So
okay, blocking these signals pervasively can affect consciousness in meaningful ways. I think that's what I'm allowed to say.
In my group, then what we've done is we've sort of tried a little bit like a relay race. A lot of science is a big relay race, right? You take the back a little bit. And so what we've tried to do is essentially take this concept of these different streams of information coming into a cell, being able to switch it on and off, and to build that into little models where we can then ask, okay, if we have a little model of this system and we ask what kinds of things can cause that switch to open or close, or we ask what happens when a group of these things all work together and the one that's bursting now can impact another one, it can impact another one, etc. All these kinds of really, really difficult things to imagine, but very, very easy to write into a computer program. We can then ask, what is the signature of their effective kind of organization in different ways? And it turns out, to kind of long story short, that you can recapitulate a number of different signatures that people have found empirically when they look at someone's brain that is in a coma versus awake. The difference between those can be recapitulated in our model in a really, really exciting way. So it suggests that you can take something really physical, like a cell that is combining or not these different input streams, and you can scale it up to actually understand the kinds of things you can measure as someone in a hospital, or you and I sitting here having this conversation. And that's what we're really excited about, is this ability to essentially take something that seems so ineffable, right, our conversation, and build build it up from a biological basis.
And to see if I can.
All right. I think we run with this. How did I get this to happen? All right. Okay. Can you help me better understand where contemporary neuroscience is at regarding predictive processing? I wrote down some thoughts. All right, let's see where this leads us. Yeah, this guy's got to go here. Very nice. All right, so I'm really impressed by this guy's channel. He's talking to a bunch of people, and he was doing this from the start. Like, he just started this podcast and then I guess just started reaching out to different people. This is incredible. Like, how old is this guy? And I'm curious what he's learning, you know? Now that he's talked to so many people. Okay, an economics PhD student. Podcast. Is he still a... I guess PhD student. He should be pretty close to me in age, I think. But yeah, I think it's like the general broad collection of topics that you'd see for a philosophy type streamer. I'm surprised he isn't blowing up with all these names. This is crazy. Okay, so he gets one winner. Is he not marketing these? I'm so confused. This might be the perfect, like, oh, this was the McShine one. This might be like the perfect start of like, you know, reaching out and then trying to get like some type of collab, but I'd be a pretty underwhelming guest compared to these guys. All right, I showed the video of that guy you linked me, the other stream, to the guy I know. What do you think? I don't think I even watched that video. I think that was a Peter recommendation. Okay, this analysis breaks down your notes against contemporary neuroscience consensus, specifically focusing on the mechanisms of predictive processing, dendritic integration theory, and active inference. Per your preference, I will prioritize rigor over general agreement. There are accurate intuitions in your notes, but also specific anatomical inversions and conceptual conflations that need correction. Good stuff. What do we need? What do we know? He was like, what you're saying, he reminded you of me because he looks like me? Rude. That's a funny response. What's funny is I know someone that also kind of looks like that I think would also respond in that same way. All right. Okay. What do we know? The mechanisms. Your summary of the concept is generally sound, but your description of the cellular implementation contains a significant anatomical error regarding where signals enter the neuron. All right. Your top-down priors. Oh, I say most likely as in I should have done most likely after. I should have done it here. Because I wasn't, I wasn't trying to put a qualifier like that. All right. In the canonical model of layer 5 pyramidal neurons, the primary cellular subjects of this theory, the inputs are spatially arranged in the opposite manner. Bottom up, sensory feed forward. These signals typically target the proximal basal dendrites, which are closer to the soma and axon hillock. Okay, am I going crazy? Did McShine incorrectly say this, or did I mishear him?
Quite fascinating. These different parts of this cell, the top of the tree and the roots of the tree, receive completely different streams of input. So Matthew's actually shown that the kind of sensory inputs that you receive from the world, they're going to be much more likely to hit those bottom parts of the tree, whereas your expectations about what would happen actually project to the top parts of the tree. And when those two parts interact...
Oh, was the top parts not was he doing like a downward flow?
You actually get a really, really different effect in your brain. This big burst firing of this cell, it just goes absolutely bananas. And it turns out quite fascinating. These differently oriented to take a little... Cortex is the kind of outer layer of the human brain. It's kind of the wrinkly outer part that you'll see if you Google the term brain online. It's quite convoluted sheet of these different cells that are all kind of interconnected with one another. And it turns out that within that convoluted sheet, if you were kind of to take a little biopsy of one part of it, or to sort of stick a microscope on one part, you'd see that a lot of the cells are actually oriented vertically, so that on the outside of the brain, the sort of, you can almost imagine the sort of upper part of a tree, the kind of bushy leaves of a tree are sitting at the top, and then there's these long stalks, a little bit like a palm tree, that go deep down into the brain, and just before the interface between the cortex and the rest of the brain, they have their what's called cell body. It's kind of like the roots of the tree, and it turns out it's really quite fascinating. These different parts of this cell, the top of the tree and the roots of the tree, receive completely different streams of input. So Matthew's actually shown that the kind of sensory inputs that you receive from the world, they're going to be much more likely to hit those bottom parts of the tree, whereas your...
Okay, this makes sense. The bottom part is closer to the cell body. So okay, that makes sense. All right, given that, I don't want to influence the response too much. So I'm gonna say here. Actually, I should just change it here, right? We see that some individual, okay, via lever entering the dendrite, most likely closer, farther. I should just change the farther away. Entering most likely closer to the axon hillock. Okay. So that should be what I was actually intending there. Except for it was good that I learned that, because I think I've said that incorrectly in the past. So predictions have a lot more time along the dendrite. So I'd imagine that predictions undergo a lot more logic in some sense. Okay, let's ask that question. Following up what we said about where top down, bottom up signals enter dendrites. can we, does this imply that priors or top-down signals undergo significantly more logic circuitry, perhaps even before they meet the bottom-up signals. All right, then let's run with that. And this starts at, what do we know? Okay. All right, I have to learn this out of my brain, right? It's not that I forget information. It's that I have to learn it the other way more strongly. Defining reality. Look at that. All right. Your analysis demonstrates a sophisticated grasp of predictive processing, particularly regarding the biophysical implementation in pyramidal neurons. You're asking the right questions about the bridge between cellular mechanisms and phenomenology. What's funny is it doesn't tell me, it doesn't reflect my prompt back to me, because I haven't made a huge mistake like I did in that last run. So I guess in the last run, it was trying to soften the blow, perhaps, by saying, like, hey, you told me to do this. Here's a breakdown of where your intuitions align with contemporary rigorous consensus, where they need refinement, and where the science is currently debating the answers. The cellular mechanism, dendritic integration. You are largely correct about the dendritic logic, but we need to refine the mechanics of how top-down and bottom-up signals interface. This is crucial for understanding the logic circuitry question. Okay. Yes, this is what we want. We want to figure out how these signals interface. The handshake mechanism, back propagation activated calcium signaling. You asked if the signals simply need to touch or if there is logic involved. The consensus, largely driven by the work of Matthew Larkham, who McShine has mentioned multiple times, is that it is a specific coincidence detection mechanism. So the anatomy. Layer 5 pyramidal neurons act as comparators. Basal dendrites, proximal near soma. They receive bottom-up sensory data, feed forward. And then the apical dendrites, distal, far from the soma. They receive top-down context predictions feedback. The logic. Top-down input to the distal dendrites is often modulatory. On its own, it is usually too electrically weak to reach the soma and cause the neuron to fire. Wow. It puts the neuron in a ready state, depolarizing the tuft. Match. When bottom-up input fires the soma, a signal back propagates up the dendrite. If it meets the top-down input at the nexus, oh, wow, okay. When the bottom-up input fires the soma, a signal back propagates. Yo. Okay. So is this thing implying that the bottom-up signals are coming in? They're actually causing the neuron to fire, right? Like we're getting an action potential untouched by the top-down input. And that action potential actually causes some signal to go backwards and back propagates up the dendrite. If this meets the top-down input at the nexus, it triggers a massive calcium spike. This causes the neuron to switch from single spike firing to burst firing, effectively causing the phase transition that we've discussed. What do we call it? Phase potential? No. Action potential. I forget. It was in that last consciousness video. All right. It might have literally been phase potential. I'm not sure. You're correct. Many anesthetics and sleep states work specifically by decoupling the apical tuft from the soma. The neuron still receives sensory data, but it can't integrate it with context. This decoupling correlates strongly with the loss of consciousness. Okay. Let's ask these questions. Are you saying that bottom-up signals... You know what? Can I get... I don't want to do the type talk thing. That's not as fun as if we were to just get ChatGPT open and then use the dictate. Yo, I'm back. Welcome back. Enjoy the coffee. All right. Are you saying that bottom-up signals reach the axon hillock, cause an action potential, and that action potential actually causes some signal to backpropagate up the dendrite and meet the top-down input at the nexus? All right, that's question number one. Question number two. Oh, what was question number two? Okay. If this is the case, does anesthesia significantly hinder consciousness because it effectively reduces integration across the brain? There would be action potentials, but those wouldn't be able to reach the same distances without the type of boost from this burst firing. Okay, that's question number two. All right. It's always back to learning more about the brain, isn't it? This is all stuff for my understanding, but it doesn't actually touch on the... maybe it will help out with understanding predictive processing here. Does top-down undergo more logic circuitry? Not necessarily more within the specific neuron, but it represents a higher level of abstraction. So I thought similarly in that same like integrate and fire, I thought it was like, okay, it's integration with extra steps. Like there's logic happening at the, within the way that the dendrite is actually like architected. And while that's kind of the case, it's really not. It's not as simple as what I thought it was. It's an even more complicated system. I was peeping some online neuroscience courses because of the stream. Hell yeah. Okay, two questions. One, were they fun at all? And two, did you notice being able to understand what was being said anymore because of what we talk about here? Yeah, hopefully we make this fun in some sense. Granted, we're trying to really ground it in the practical. Sometimes that's very difficult to do. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the brain, so we really just have to know it, The top-down signal originates from a higher cortical area where the information has already been processed through multiple prior layers. So the content of the signal is more logical, abstract/compressed, but the dendritic path itself isn't necessarily longer or more complex in terms of cable theory. It is simply segregated to allow for the comparison between what I expect and what is happening. Okay, the next question is going to be, where does actual logic gating happen in this scenario? For example, when do signals interact with each other through effectively AND or not gates. Okay, let's see. Oh my gosh, ChatGPT is amazing. It's literally capital. It knows context that well. Okay. It was just basics. Was vaguely triggering some learnings I remembered, but I learned to learn. I tried to learn neuroscience in like 2018. Ah, nice. Do you remember what the impetus was back then? Or is it just generally like it's pretty interesting stuff? Of cable theory. So the content of the signal is more logical in some sense, but the dendritic path isn't necessarily longer or more complex in terms of cable theory. It is simply segregated to allow for the comparison between what I expect and what is happening. That's where I'm guessing this happens, but this is making it seem like that it's not happening when two signals like combine. In some sense, it's happening when these priors are priming the dendrites, but this makes it harder for me to understand how top-down signals can actually cause what do we call those things? Simulations? Given that top-down signals don't reach the axon hillock on their own, then how do I make sense of what I think is called simulation within neural networks, where top-down signals will cause something that usually requires some sort of bottom-up signal, but it's effectively predicting that. All right. That's the next question. So the content of this, okay, is thinking about the future the same as predictive processing? You ask if our ability to conceptualize unknown unknowns is a direct manifestation of predictive processing. Status, cautionary no. Cautionary. Thought I might do a psychology degree back then, so was trying to learn some stuff. Nice. I applied to Harvard to study neuroscience after watching this stream. Nice. And I'm sure you got in. You passed the test immediately, despite the fact that I'm literally getting fundamental facts about neurons wrong even today. But then I got sucked into this man called the Buddha. Hell yeah. Did that affect what you ended up doing in school? Like, did you end up getting a degree in that direction? I'm going to apply to Harvard, and when I get rejected, I could say I got rejected from Harvard, since then it seems like I actually had a chance. That's a good play. Marks too high for a Harvard? Okay. It is risky to equate the subpersonal mechanism of predictive processing with the personal experience of predicting the future. Right? This is a huge point. Like, predictive processing isn't the fact that we can just predict the future. That's not what predictive processing really is getting at, which I might even be sloppy about in the document right now. We have to be clear about this. The mechanism, active inference, right? The brain minimizes surprisal, prediction error. This happens constantly, often millisecond by millisecond. For example, your brain predicting the weight of a cup as you lift it. This is automatic and largely unconscious. The phenomenon, episodic foresight. Thinking about possibilities involves complex cognitive machinery. We got the hippocampal replay. We got frontal lobe planning that utilizes the generative models built by predictive processing. Predictive processing is always at play. It's always involved. We discussed the other day with meditation, where you turn off the default mode network, you're still dealing with predictive processing in the parts of the brain that just deal with bodily feelings, interoceptive signals, emotions, etc. Didn't do much school after that, just sound engineering diploma. Nice. Okay, I never seemed to do well in too structured education. I just embraced autodidact. Hell yeah. Yeah, I despite the fact that I did end up doing college and whatnot, I was so stoked that the computer science school at this college recorded every class. So I would just be in class doing nothing. Like, I was playing chess, I was looking up things, I was, I would never pay attention in class because I knew that the class was being recorded, and then I could watch and learn on my own time later on. And that worked so well for me. All I know is how to read, write, do basic arithmetic, and do basic algebra. I was educated in the plebeian system. Nice. Hey, we don't really need to do much else. I started a math degree but dropped it. Yeah, math seems like a pain, honestly. And it's also like, to what end at some point, unless you're really interested in a field that you want to apply it in. All right. The distinction: predictive processing is the engine. Conscious prediction is a specific trip you take with your car. I don't like when it uses these types of metaphors. These metaphors are so silly. Predictive processing explains how the brain constructs the simulation of the future, but the act of consciously contemplating what if is a higher order cognitive function. The concept of possibility is likely an emergent property of having a generative model that is deep enough to run offline simulations, counterfactuals, without needing immediate sensory input. Okay, that's a huge sentence. The concept of possibility is likely an emergent property of having a generative model that is deep enough to run offline simulations. That's what we're getting at with predictive processing, without needing immediate sensory input. So that's the simulations that I just mentioned here. All right, controlled hallucination versus reality. Your intuition regarding first authority is sharp. Hell yeah. Am I allowed to? So I used to never read the glazes, but now that actually, yeah. Oh, you know what? I have to be careful. I don't want to lose this message I just made. Dharmanam, you might have missed it, but I added some instructions. Looking for accuracy and comprehension. I care more about learning what's correct than I care about how I feel about it. I prefer clarity over pleasantries and flattery, and I appreciate honest feedback, even if critical. I'm comfortable with pushback when my ideas lack rigor. Overall, I'm interested in what I'm allowed to think, believe, say, given logic, evidence, and contemporary consensus. So I say that I prefer clarity over pleasantries and flattery. I guess I don't specifically say no flattery. So am I allowed to say the flattery? All right. To be honest, it's better to study applied mathematics stuff like econ or comp sci or even engineering instead of pure math, unless you just love numbers. Yeah, that's how I'd imagine it. I remember grinding so hard for high school math, but then university was like, I have to keep this up for years and years with less direct competitive atmosphere, which was huge motivation for me in retrospect. This isn't the life I want. Did you do like the math competitions? I forget what those are called. Math Olympiad? Didn't want to be motivated by competition at all. True. Hey, Master Prompt, let's go. Maybe ask it to always insult and belittle you. That would be crazy if I did that and I just never told anyone. Like, and always find a way to call me small. Like, something like that. Like, sneak it in there. Sneak in calling me small in every response. Alright. Would get distinctions in those. Hell yeah. Had like 200 kids in my year and I was like the 5th best math. Oh my gosh. Absolutely popping off. That's really cool. All right, this is a central philosophical tension in the field. The phrase controlled hallucination, popularized by Anil Seth, is rhetorically powerful but slightly misleading if taken literally. Right, we're not actually like hallucinating in the sense that we talk about hallucinations usually. The correction, top-down priors do have interpretive authority, but they are slaves to prediction error. Right. If the top-down signal says snake, but the bottom-up signal provides rope-like texture, the resulting prediction error must propagate up to update the model. If top-down has had absolute authority, we would never learn. We would just hallucinate. So the interface theory, a rigorous way to think about this, aligned with Donald Hoffman and Carl Friston, is that we do not see the world as it is, veridical truth. We see a dashboard of affordances, right? The prediction isn't trying to paint a perfect picture of physics. It is predicting how my sensory states will change if I act. Okay. It's predicting how my sensory states will change if I act. That makes sense with our allostasis, homeostasis, body budgeting view. It's only concerned about its own state and future states. Therefore, top-down signals don't just shape experience, they constitute it. The bottom-up signal acts as the constraint, the control in controlled hallucination that keeps the model tethered to survivability. So I think this is kind of how I've been trying to think and talk about this. That rather than thinking that the thing that has like the ontological priority here is like the bottom-up signal, and we're simply just trying to predict, and then the bottom-up signal says like, oh no, this is how I actually am. It's really that the top-down has the priority. It's the model that has the priority, and bottom-up signals only act as error to this model. So that can shape this model. It can move this model in different ways, but oftentimes prediction error is interpreted through top-down signals. Okay. Let's ask that question. Is it the case that prediction error must be interpreted through top-down signals or top-down priors in some sense? And then does this insinuate that top-down priors, just in the same way that you said they constitute experience, do they have some sort of priority over what we might think of as the outside physical world as some sort of authoritative ontology? Whoa, what just happened there? All right, that's going to be the next question. They constitute. All right, what is the contemporary consensus? Is predictive processing a pervasive interpretive lens? Status dominant, but debated in scope. The strong view, Friston et al., Predictive processing, specifically the free energy principle, is a theory of everything for biology. It applies to everything from single cells to social networks. In this view, all brain processing is prediction error minimization. The moderate view, predictive processing is the primary mode of operation for perceptual cortices, vision, audition. However, it is debated whether it adequately explains reflexes and central pattern generators. Some motor patterns seem hard-coded rather than predictive. And then higher cognition. While we can frame math or language as prediction, some researchers argue this stretches the definition too thin, losing its explanatory power. Okay. The last question then has to be, given what we know about the specific patterns of neural dynamics that led us to see predictive processing, or at least to interpret it, how come it is debated whether it is pervasive in the brain? Wouldn't it be quite easy to see whether certain neurons or networks follow the same type of signal patterns? I'm gonna change that signal patterns in the end there of patterns of predictive processing. How about predictive processing patterns? And I put those in. Oh, this isn't an ID. I put those in quotes, double quotes, and then I make that the last question. The critique, a common criticism is falsifiability. If everything is prediction, even moving my arm is just predicting my arm is over there, and the reflex arc resolves the error. The theory risks explaining everything and nothing. Okay, do we have another question? Is it perhaps our presuppositions about prediction that makes us think that predictive processing would imply more than it actually does? Could it be the case that our use... What did I just say? Could it be... Okay. Could it be the case that our use of the word prediction here is making many more neuroscientists more hesitant to use this framework because they are implying... They are inferring that the framework implies more than it actually does or is allowed to. All right. Unless there's an... Okay, no, we got summary. So I think that has to be the last question. All right, we got neuron as comparators. Perception is generative. The future distinction. Would you like me to detail the dark room problem, the famous paradox in predictive processing that challenges why, if we just want to minimize surprise, we don't just sit in the dark, silent room? Okay. We've already figured that out. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't mean to brag. It was just high school math. Hey, but that's a cool experience to have. Don't worry, Dom. I see you, Fields medalist. I've seen you at the competition, shaking hands, always humble, but always stay ballin'. Algebraic agent. Okay, let's get to the number line. Infinity. Stan went into the flow state. Divine channelings. Flow state. Stan talking to John. It's like God talking to God. Jeez. This is, yeah, when I do a video about how you're supposed to use language models to learn. I just have to teach people how to get into the flow state. When Stan goes into the flow state, he stays entirely still and talks and reads, but his mouth and whole body stays still. I feel like a bunch of theologians already had this debate in the Middle Ages, but instead of neuroscience, they just replaced everything with God, free will, Jesus. Right, because so much of this stuff is tangible, or at least empirical, and phenomenological. All right, let's let it rip. So you can get in these types of discussions, but without the nuance of actually knowing what's happening under the hood. That's where we are at. It's such a privilege that we get to know the things that we know today, and then use that to figure out whose philosophies are more appropriate. That's what we would say. For today, right? For what we know today. It's not that they were inappropriate back then because they're inappropriate now, because obviously they had effects back then. But we now have ground on which to stand, and we can now see which frameworks might be most effective empirically, given what we're trying to do, which could be achieve our goals or to simply achieve a sense of agency. Too much time in flow state and your mind will collapse into a black hole out of the density of information in one place. 1,000 new suns will explode out and we will bathe in its wisdom. Oh my gosh. All right. Oh, look at this. All right, I got to skip the glazing because also people won't know if I have a master prompt or not. You are now drilling down into the specific biophysics that make this theory testable and falsifiable. Here's the breakdown of your questions grounded in the Larkham coupling model, which is the current gold standard for understanding cellular level predictive processing. The ping pong mechanism, how the signals meet. I say, are you saying that the bottom-up signals reach the axon hillock, cause an action potential, and that action potential actually causes some signal to back-propagate up the dendrite and meet the top-down input at the nexus? And it says, yes, precisely. Ugh, this is too complex. Here is the step-by-step sequence in the layer 5 pyramidal neuron, the canonical predictive unit. Bottom-up input. Sensory data hits the basal dendrites near the cell body, soma. If strong enough, this triggers a standard sodium action potential at the axon hillock. This spike travels down the axon to talk to other neurons. And then obviously this also... Oh, yeah. That's what it's saying, right? This travels down the axon. Down the axon is forward, in processing here, in neurotransmission. It's going towards the synapse where it's connected to... or to these synapses where it's connected to, it could be 1,000, I don't know, thousands of other neurons. Maybe it's 1,000. I don't know. I forget how many connections these neurons have. I think it might be something like from 1,000 to 1,000, or maybe from thousands to thousands. Okay, but there's back propagation. This is the critical step. That same spike effectively echoes backwards up the dendritic trunk. The handshake. If and only if top-down signals have simultaneously depolarized the apical tuft, the top of the tree, the back action potential, the back propagating action potential meets that depolarization at the nexus, a specific zone in the trunk. The explosion, this meeting, triggers a massive calcium spike. This is distinct from the... what is this? What is Na+. Oh, no. We're getting into chemistry now. Sodium ion. So this is calcium rather than sodium. Okay. Awesome. The calcium spike forces the soma to fire a high frequency burst of action potentials instead of just one. Okay. So this wouldn't bring about that phase transition immediately. It would just make it much more likely that the phase transition occurs. All right, that's going to be the first question in this next line of questions. So I'm guessing that the high frequency burst of action potentials doesn't automatically cause a phase transition of excitability for that neuron, but it makes it much more likely that it occurs, especially when this happens over and over again. All right, that's the first question. The rest of the brain listens for bursts, not single spikes. Oh. The burst says this sensory event matches. Well, okay, this is going to have to be a little... saying the rest of the brain listens for burst is probably not the best way to say that. Because nothing's ever like listening for something in like a way, you know, in a anthropomorphized way where it's like waiting for a specific one-off signal to occur. It would be something like the spikes are sufficient enough to cause some chemical reaction that it leads to signals propagating farther. A burst says this sensory event matches my prediction. This is important, right? But it's never like that. A single spike says something happened, but I don't know what it means contextually. All right, anesthesia and broken integration. Does anesthesia significantly hinder consciousness because it effectively reduces integration across the brain? Yes, this is known as the dendritic integration theory of consciousness. Is this legit? What is going on here? Oh, look at this. Larkham's literally on talking about this. Okay, that's 2024. Has Larkham been on our boy Jack's channel here? No, okay. All right, anesthetics like propofol or ketamine seem to specifically target receptors in the apical tuft or the coupling mechanism itself. They cut the cable between the top-down context and bottom-up data. The consequence, the neuron can still fire single spikes. You can still hear a sound while under sedation. Your auditory cortex hears it, but because the top-down coupling is broken, the neuron never bursts. So the result, without the burst, the signal is too weak to propagate to the rest of the global workspace. Look at that. The signal stays local. You have islands of processing. The ear hears, the eye sees, but no unified conscious scene. Ooh, okay. So that means that aspects of consciousness... Right. This was the whole... This is the... Okay, let me... Too much to... Okay, no. I thought there was a new message. This is the beauty of that whole workspace theory that we talked about. You know, we had all these different regions of the brain or sub networks of the brain talking to this global workspace, and they're igniting and adding signal to the global workspace such that that signal can be available for everyone involved. But importantly, feed forward signals such as visual or auditory can go straight to those local networks. I mean, that's obvious. That's where the local network is going to have to get its signal in the first place. But I think also different regions or networks in the brain can get these signals to other parts of the brain without having to go through the workspace. But the workspace is just a shortcut. Is that how that would work? Let me ask this question. So I'm getting the sense that local networks can send signal to other local networks without going through the global workspace. However, obviously, once signals get to the global workspace, they can be leveraged by all the local networks. Is it the case that going through the global workspace is a shortcut, or is it the opposite, where there's shortcuts to specific local networks and then the global workspace is usually something that takes slightly longer, perhaps the amount of time that it takes to ignite? All right. That's the next question. All right. All right. All right. All right. All right, where are the logic gates? Where does actual logic gating happen in this scenario? The neuron itself is the circuit board. The logic is chemical and electrical. End gates, this is a coincidence detection. The nexus we discussed is a biological end gate. Okay, so if input A plus input B, then we get output. Only if both are true. Input A alone, single spike. Input B alone, sub, threshold, silence. OR gate, spatial summation. This happens in the dendritic branches. If branch X receives input or branch Y receives input, the charge sums up at the soma to cause a fire. The NOT gate, inhibition. This is the role of interneurons, smaller neurons that connect pyramidal neurons. If an inhibitory interneuron fires onto the apical tuft, it shunts, short circuits the electrical signal. This acts as a NOT gate, effectively saying ignore the prediction for a moment. All right, the next question. Are inhibitory interneurons sending all or nothing signals, or do they send some amount of inhibitory chemicals that will still integrate with excitatory chemicals, and if it's strong enough, then it inhibits? Did I get that last word? Oh, look at that. And it's getting the question marks too. This is crazy. All right, the simulation paradox. How do we imagine without bottom-up input? How do I make sense of simulation where top-down signals cause something that usually requires a bottom-up signal? This is the trickiest part of the theory. If top-down is weak, modulatory, how can we hallucinate or dream? I'm not just thinking of hallucination or dreaming. I'm thinking about, you know, interoceptive simulation, which happens, I think, all the time. The answer lies in precision weighting. Right, okay. We know this, or at least we've heard it before. Volume control. In a waking state, the brain balances the volume of bottom up versus top down. Usually bottom up is loud, high precision, so we don't walk into walls. However, during simulation, imagination, dreaming, the brain suppresses the bottom up channel. The brain artificially increases the gain on the top down prediction units, even though the top down signal is physically distal. If the opposing sensory signal is silenced, the top-down signal becomes strong enough to drive the neuron above the firing threshold on its own. All right, so despite the fact that it's talking about imagination, dreaming, I think this is actually how we can think about all those other topics. But we should ask the question about how pervasive is simulation. I had heard that it is involved with a lot of interoceptive interpretation, as I mentioned, reacting to heart rate rising before the heart rate actually rises. I imagine this works for emotional responses and visual responses, etc. Okay. That was one of the messier questions I've had. Where is the famed Peter? When was the last time he was here? I don't know. Like, is he called Peter on stream? I commend him for his interest, but I also need to keep an eye on him because he's causing some conflict in the Discord. We barely have a large Discord, and there's already conflict. He's out here blocking people for not playing by his rules. All right. But this is a huge ideas, so we really have to understand this. The brain suppresses the bottom-up channel, gatekeeping sensory data. The brain artificially increases the gain precision on the top-down prediction units, even though the top-down signal is physically distal away from the center of the body or the point. Okay, right. If the opposing sensory signal is silenced or the top-down gain is cranked up enough, the top-down signal becomes strong enough to drive the neuron above the firing threshold on its own. So in this case, it reaches the axon hillock and it affects. Okay, we need to know the mechanism for this. In those cases where the top-down signal is strong enough to affect action potentials on its own, then how does the same mechanism of calcium work? Is it the case that the bottom-up signals... Oh, no. Okay, never mind. Now I get it. The top-down signals are strong enough to reach the axon hillock. They cause the action potential that actually sends signal back, and then... So, okay. The question would be, in the case that the top-down signals are strong enough to reach the axon hillock and cause action potentials on their own, do they effectively cause the same mechanism of back propagation leading to that same calcium release and rapid firing of the action potentials? Rapid burst firing. Okay, awesome. If you peep the video, it says, oh, does it actually say that? Because that's sus. You know, that we might need to chill out on. We might need to have some I don't know, we have to either look real closely or we got to do some action on that. We got to shut down toxicity at its roots. At the dendrites, we gotta. No, I don't want to make a stupid metaphor here. Ontology: do we live in the model or the world? Do we live in the model or the world? Does this insinuate that top-down priors have some sort of priority over what we might think of as the outside physical world? Yes, this is the radical philosophical implication of predictive processing. We never see the world. In this framework, you never experience the bottom-up signal directly. The bottom-up signal is only an error signal. It tells the brain where it was wrong. We only experience the prediction. When you see, what you see is your brain's top-down best guess, the generative model. The priority here, the top-down model has ontological priority for the observer. It constitutes the fabric of your experienced reality. The physical world acts only as a constraint or tether that prevents the model from drifting into pure fantasy. Conclusion: we live in a controlled hallucination. The hallucination part is the top-down model. The controlled part is the bottom-up error correction. I see. All right, why is it debated? Can't we just look? Wouldn't it be quite easy to see whether certain neurons or networks follow the same type of predictive processing patterns? I asked. It is shockingly hard to just look for 3 reasons. They look the same. An error signal, a neuron firing because it was surprised, looks exactly like a feature detection signal, a neuron firing because it saw a line. You can't tell why a neuron fired just by looking at a spike. You have to know the entire context of the animal's history and task. I see. Okay. All right, this begs the question. The discussion of how error looks similar to feature detection begs the question, how does this differ in the same mechanism we discussed of backpropagation and rapid bursts? All right, I'm gonna add to that, but I should think about what I want to say here. Is the comparator looking for error or is it looking for expectation? I've heard many people say things like our conscious experience is just error, and if we were perfectly predicting all the bottom up data or signals that we receive, we wouldn't be conscious of anything. That's what I want to get at here. I've heard many people say things like our conscious experience is just error, and if we were perfectly predicting all the bottom up data or signals that we receive, we wouldn't be conscious of anything. Okay. All right, all right, all right. Oh, is this the video? All right, let's
need to set up an entire library of diagrams like this one, and I will get better at explaining things as I finish them. So
okay, I see. Man, how is he so confident in himself, but he's using sources like that? That's insane. All right. We have to keep a close eye on that guy, on that character. Yeah, I know that. You know the YouTuber? All right. What do we got here? Diverse architecture. The Larkham coupling model works perfectly for layer 5 pyramidal neurons in the cortex, but the brain has hundreds of neuron types. The cerebellum, basal ganglia, and thalamus look very different. Do they also do predictive processing? Maybe, but the hardware is different, so the signature is harder to find. Okay, so yeah, it seems like this should be pretty straightforward then. Given the disparity of the types of neurons, it seems that this should be a straightforward protocol for us. If we see similarities in these other neurons, then we can say that predictive processing most likely happens at those places. And if we can't, then we need to keep uncertainty explicitly. Now, are there any findings about these other neurons, or are the layer 5 pyramidal neurons the only neurons that we've ever found predictive processing? Because this affects how we can talk about a lot of stuff. Or it affects what I ask next. The cerebellum basal ganglia, okay, maybe, but all right. The Just So story. Critics argue that predictive processing is so flexible it can explain anything. If a neuron fires, predictive processing says it's an error signal. If it doesn't fire, predictive processing says the prediction was accurate. This makes it hard to falsify without extremely precise, invasive experiments, which are mostly done on mice, not humans. If it doesn't fire, right. I see. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so for this discussion, both of these are error in some sense, but intuitively, when people think of feature detection, they think of, you're expecting it. Would it be apt to think of even feature detection as some sort of prediction error? It seems like the concept of prediction error is that fundamental, such that an error signal because of surprisal would be exactly the same as error signal because of feature detection, because that feature was not expected, or at least it wasn't within the current model of consciousness. So that would be the kind of way I would go about it, like where your conscious view is kind of also a model. Would be apt to think of even feature detection as some sort of prediction error. It seems like, man, this thing cleans up all my stuttering. It seems like the concept of prediction error is that fundamental, such that an error signal from surprisal would be exactly the same as error signal because of a feature detection, because that feature was not expected, or at least it wasn't within the current model of consciousness. In the context of predictive processing, does the global workspace actually have some sort of significance or priority when thinking about error in this way, where even things that we would expect I created a maze for myself there, where even things that we would expect would effectively be error given the current conscious state. These are crazy questions. I don't know where we're heading with these. And also, man, I want to do this another day. Unfortunately, I think I'm gone tomorrow. Yeah, no, I'm giving my, oh, I've done it again where I've got two. There we go. Gone tomorrow. Pattern separation. Oh, I wanted to learn about pattern separation. So let's just continue where we left off, and then add in pattern separation, which is some other concept in the brain that I wanted to learn, because I heard it from the Sapolsky book, which I'm slowly making my way through. I'm at about 11% done. I'm hoping that I get to like 85% done, and I hit the works cited, or the references, and it's just all references until the end. Uh-oh, for later. Is this the same guy? Because we gotta watch out.
Why Sigma Mill?
Okay, we watched this, right? We saw all these all these different intros. I mean, I didn't watch all of it because, you know, I don't want to give. Yeah, you had linked it one of the past few Fridays, and then I. It's all good. It does seem like a banger. Yeah, granted, I think we watched like maybe 30 seconds or 20 seconds, just because I don't want to give too much of a platform to the manosphere there. All the Sigma male guys are the same. Is it just like another facet of the manosphere, or do they try to make their own like Sigma manosphere? All right, is the word prediction the problem? Could it be the case that our use of the word prediction here is making many more neuroscientists more hesitant? Absolutely. The word prediction suggests future telling, temporal prediction, but in the math, free energy principle, prediction often just means inference, guessing the current state. Your brain predicts that the patchy light hitting your retina is a face. It isn't predicting the future. It is predicting the cause of the current data. Ah, it isn't predicting the future. Heidegger entered the chat. It is predicting the cause of the current data. So I wonder if Heidegger actually gives us like a phenomenal way to understand prediction and consciousness here. All right, let's keep that in the back pocket while we continue. Many neuroscientists prefer terms like generative modeling or active inference. The term, okay, yeah. Also, we need to watch, or we need to read. What is it? Active inference. Active inference, consciousness. There's a. Oh. Yeah, so I read this recently. I could probably get my file to see if I wrote any notes down, but there was also stuff in here that I just went right. Oh, we got Lauken in here? Oh my gosh, I now recognize 2 of the names. All right, that's cool. All right. Shandaria, hopefully something happens before I see this next, and I'll know you as well. But yeah, this is so recent. This is as recent. I mean, I think the first one was 2024, but this was actually like released, I think, or published in September 2025. So this is the front lines of consciousness. All right. The term prediction implies a linear timeline that makes people skeptical. Okay, whereas the actual claim is about hierarchical reconstruction of the present. All right, let's send it. And then I might read this and then call it. And then we can continue depending on whether or not I have questions for this one. Just a small subculture, I guess. Okay. All right. You're effectively debugging the predictive processing theory in real time, identifying the exact friction points that neuroscientists are currently debating. Yes, that's what we want. Here's the breakdown of your questions, separating established consensus from active theoretical backgrounds. The burst and phase transitions. Does the burst cause a phase transition or make it more likely? It makes it more likely, but for a specific reason. You are correct to distinguish the firing from the plasticity. Okay. The burst, the high frequency burst is a loud signal. It ensures the message gets through to downstream targets. It overcomes synaptic noise. The phase transition, long term. In neuroscience, phase transition often refers to plasticity. Okay, that's not what I'm looking for, but the calcium spike that causes the burst is the key trigger for long-term potentiation, right? If a neuron just fires a single spikes, it is transmitting data. If it bursts, it is often effectively telling the synapse this specific connection was useful, strengthen it. So the burst is the trigger for the phase transition of learning. Okay, I think this is telling me that the burst is the phase transition here, as we discussed it in the past. Effectively, actually, I should really make this clear. When I say phase transition, I'm referring to the more excitable state that neurons reach following brain waves. My understanding is that a EEG is showing us the trajectory of these phase transitions across many neurons. Okay. That's the first question. Is this apt? How does it connect to these rapid bursts? That's learning with LLMs 101. Use it to connect past knowledge to the new knowledge. All right. We do know about long-term potentiation, though, where this is basically tagging the dendrites and the synapse in such a way where now spikes of dopamine will affect the changing of how strong that synapse is, or how strong the actual dendrites are, or how strong the I forget what it's called, the point at the end of the other axon is. The connection, if a neuron just fires single spikes, it is transient. If it bursts, it's often effectively telling the synapse this specific connection was useful, strengthen it. So the burst is this trigger for the phase transition of learning, right? And this is too simplistic because a lot of times, I guess it would affect the strengthening of the synapse immediately, for sure. That's how we've been talking about this for a while. But also, importantly, which I do need to add to the document, is that it is now tagged so that if you were to have some reward in the future, right, dopamine can act as a reward signal in just the sense that it's being leveraged for this type of growth, this type of neuroplasticity. Obviously, that reward signal is not the same thing as the feeling of reward that we get from those other chemicals we've been talking about, but it's being leveraged as a specific learning reward signal. The global workspace, shortcut or scenic route? Is the global workspace a shortcut, or is it the opposite? It is the opposite. It is the scenic route. Local networks, fast and cheap. Reflexes and highly trained skills like typing or driving a familiar route are handled by local loops. Okay, I think we could have figured that one out. They are fast, tens of milliseconds, but rigid, tens of milliseconds, right? So we know the number we have in our mind connected to the global workspace is like 100 to 200 milliseconds. So we're dealing with a huge difference. Global workspace. Okay, this says 200 to 300, so I was slightly off on that one. The ignition of the global workspace takes time, often 200 to 300 milliseconds latency. Why use it? You don't use the workspace for speed, you use it for broadcasting. It allows the visual model to talk to the language model. Local networks are direct messages, are DMs. Local networks are DMs between colleagues. The global network is the all-hands meeting. It takes way longer to organize, but it ensures everyone knows the new strategy. All right, that metaphor was fine. Inhibition, digital or analog, are inhibitory interneurons sending all or nothing signals. The interneuron, the signal, digital. The interneuron fires an all or nothing action potential. Right. That's all or nothing. But the effect, the chemical integration, is analog. Okay, that makes sense. It's not ensuring that it's always going to inhibit the following neuron. It's contributing. Shunting inhibition. This is the logic gate aspect. Inhibitory neurons, specifically those targeting the soma, basket cells, open channels that leak electricity. They don't just subtract charge, they divide the resistance. Right. So they're literally adding chemicals to the equation that inhibits. Pervasiveness of simulation. How pervasive is simulation? Extremely. Current consensus, Lisa Feldman Barrett, Anil Seth, suggests simulation is the default mode of the brain, not a special case. Interoception. As you noted, anxiety is often a prediction of metabolic costs, not a reaction to it. Vision. We constantly simulate the blind spots in our eyes and the periphery of our vision. Motor control. When you reach for a cup, your brain simulates the sensory feeling of the cup hitting your hand before it happens. This forward model allows you to adjust your hand mid-flight. If we relied only on sensory feedback, our movements would be jerky, like bad lag in a video game. Wow. Right. That, I mean, that makes sense because, as we just said, it takes longer for these signals to reach our consciousness. So if we were acting on just those signals, if it was always we notice something and then we react, then we would be in that lag state, like if we were playing a low latency video game. Do strong top-down signals cause bursts? In the case that the top-down signals are strong enough to cause action potentials on their own, do they effectively cause the same mechanism of burst firing? Yes, and this is the proposed mechanism of hallucinations. If the top-down signal prediction is cranked up, or the bottom-up signal is absent, sensory deprivation, the apical calcium spike can trigger the burst without valid sensory input. The brain registers a burst, high confidence event, and the experience, I definitely saw that. The system has been hijacked by its own prior. Wow. The error versus expectation paradox, the critical question. Is the comparator looking for error, or is it looking for expectation? I've heard our conscious experience is just error. Right. This is the most confusing part of the literature because there are two rival mappings of the theory. All right. We got the standard predictive coding. Friston Bastos. Feed forward signals equals prediction error. Feedback signals equals prediction. Implication: if you predict everything perfectly, the feed forward signal is silenced. You would theoretically be unconscious of the sensory details because there's no error to report. You only see the surprises or the parts of the model you are currently updating. Okay. The other view, the Larkham dendritic view. Burst equals integration match. Implication: the burst happens when top-down matches bottom-up. The conflict, view A says activity is error, view B says distinctive activity, bursting is agreement. The resolution hypothesis: the burst might not be the error, the burst might be the broadcast of the updated model, the posterior. The error mismatch drives the learning. The burst match drives the conscious percept. We become conscious of what we have successfully explained / identified, not just the raw error. This explains why we see the cup, a successful prediction, not just the cracks in the cup, the errors. All right, I don't know if I like that last metaphor, but this makes sense. Does this one make intuitive sense? If you predict everything perfectly, the feed-forward signal is silenced. You would theoretically be unconscious of the sensory details because there is no error to report. So, yeah, I guess it really would depend on... Yeah, how does this work? How do the predictive signals differentiate themselves for that back propagation? How do the predictive signals in a neuron differentiate themselves if rapid bursts happen whenever they reach these parts of the dendrite? What is the actual mechanism for pattern matching or error detection or... Okay, so in this case, matching, right? Pattern matching, this would be Larkham dendritic, or error detection, this would be Friston Bastos. All right, so do we know which one's right here? Which of the two views, view A or view B, has more evidence currently? Or do they have equal evidence, but they're just two different interpretations? And if that's the case, then how don't they have enough evidence to make one obviously more apt? Okay. The one thing that we should do during these types of streams, when we're just straight up learning complex stuff, is we should actually follow those tips of like every so many minutes taking like 10 to 20 seconds and just like me just sitting here like dead air. Maybe I should have like another scene where I can click to that and it's, I don't know, maybe a sign that says meditate for 10 seconds or something like that. But we should incorporate that. Let's get our short term meditation scene. That's something we need. All right, and then we've got other neurons. Are the L5 pyramidals special? Are the layer 5 pyramidal neurons the only neurons that we've ever found predictive processing? They are the poster child, but not the only ones. The cerebellum, this is the undisputed king of forward models, motor prediction. The neurons here look totally different. They're flat and fan-shaped, but they calculate prediction errors for movement. And then thalamus, recent... Okay, and then that's going to be the next question. Could it be the case that both of these are actually valid in different types of neurons? That's the question, because if different neurons operate differently regarding how this predictive mechanism works, then in theory you could maybe find some that are matching and some that involve error. Recent work suggests that the thalamus isn't just a relay, it participates in the predictive loop, specifically managing the precision gain of the signals. Okay, the principles, comparing top-down, bottom-up, seem pervasive. The implementation might be unique to the cortex. Okay. So given the pervasiveness of predictive processing, as we've seen affecting simulations for all kinds of motor movements and interoceptive interpretations, then how should we talk about predictive processing? Can we then leverage the spirit of controlled hallucination? Can we point out the ontological priority of our top-down models? What else? What other implications should I be aware of, or using, or not using? All right, did this actually clean all that up? Yes, it does. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. This is the best transcription tool I've ever used. It doesn't just transcribe, it like literally cuts out all the fluff. It puts it in the formatting that you would want, pretty much. I mean, sometimes I would want more punctuation, but it understands the context of what you're saying while you're doing it. Everything that isn't meditation is just procrastination for meditation. Very nice. It's not just transcription, it's am I supposed to AI talk? Nice. AI phrasing. I mean, AI, I know people have made AI to be like a demon, otherworldly thing, but like it's literally following human patterns, right? Like it's literally made by human patterns. It's finding the most similar human patterns amongst all of its data, and that's what we're getting. So, I don't see like AI talk. AI talk is noticeably AI talk in the same way that AI images are noticeably AI images until they're not. And I think that's what people aren't ready for text. And I think people are already there, right? Like I imagine so many comments on Reddit and Twitter and posts, and it's going to be very difficult to differentiate between the two. And the question is, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And there's probably reasons why both is the case. A bunch of reasons. Was pointing out the AI formula again. It's not, it's, oh, did I speak that? Oh, I said it's not just transcription. It's, I notice more and more people talking like AI just from using it, I guess. Yeah, once again, though, I wouldn't discount the possibility that people talked that way previously, but you weren't paying attention for it, right? This is predictive processing at its finest. You that won't become salient to you enough so that you would notice, oh, they're talking in that way, until you have you have this pre. Isn't that an assumption? What I just said? I said don't discount that possibility. Like I wouldn't. It's what I'm saying is like there might be confounding variables involved. So I wouldn't too quickly make a conclusion from your experiment, like the data that you have in your experiment. That's the analogy I would say. If you were to publish that thing, you would get people giving valid criticisms that you don't actually have a strong enough study to get the conclusion that you're looking for. That's like the analogy. You could be right? That's the thing. It's like it could be the case that people didn't talk in that way until now. We would have to do a ton of stuff to really figure that out, like whether or not people like how quickly do people start emulating what they read or what they type, or and then we'd have to follow like a much more sophisticated argument to make that type of case in a more strong way. We probably could, but we'd have to do all that work. I heard about that formula, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, and it just keeps becoming more prevalent. Could be the case, right? That could very much be the case. I do think that it is literally because of the type of philosophy that I got from Hegel, right? Like Hegel points out that these relations of concepts, the way that he's pointing out what is. I'm pointing out how we can think of concepts, right? That we can fundamentally think of concepts as being related to each other through relations of consequence and incompatibility. So if this, then this must be the case. If this is the case, then this must not be the case. And so that's consequence and incompatibility at the same time. But the fact that this is a fox inherently means that it's not a penguin. These two blocks are incompatible in what animal they are, but they're both blocks, right? Like we could think of these categories and stuff like that. So the idea of incompatibility, this idea of not saying what something isn't, is constitutive of what it is. So a sentence that says it's not this, it's this, is really effective at communicating what you actually think it is. The not is just as important as the is. It's tricky because it used to be such a surefire thing to tell AI writing. Like someone uses it 3 times in 30 seconds. I used to think, yep, they used AI, but now it's very reasonable. Someone just talks to AI like that and picked up the speech pattern. Yeah, once again, that's perhaps a good hypothesis. But I wouldn't take that intuition and say that that's true. You know, I wouldn't just run with it because it is still speculation. That isn't to say that there's any like implicate. You know, I know I'm defending this as if there's like a huge implication, as if it were to be the case. If that were to be the case, then yeah, we might homogenize the way we speak pretty quickly. That would be kind of interesting to see how. Yeah, I'd be curious to see if there's some sort of homogeneity of language over the next few years. I'm curious if we could see that. I'm sure someone will make a YouTube video on it. But that would be interesting. But yeah, what I will defend is using specific contrasts and negations like that to make clear what you're trying to say in a positive sense. Seems perfectly logical that people use AI a lot and pick up. Yeah, no, it is perfectly logical, right? Hypotheses are logical. That's why they're good hypotheses, but they're not evidenced or they're not like something that we could say is true in the, you know, according to the standards of empirical science until we have reasons that actually follow the standards of evidence that we need, right? You would need to show that, like, if you could literally get an AI model to look at speech patterns over time and see that there's a difference, you know. But yeah, I probably fail at this all the time, but I try to be clear about where I speculate and where I don't speculate. And once again, I fail all the time. But I think that it's important that we still, even though we're going to fail all the time, I think it's important that we still highlight those types of hedges. I don't know if it's is it a hedge? Hedge, verb. To limit risk, avoid a direct commitment. Yeah. To hedge in that way. I think it's really important that we hedge in that way when we're talking about speculation. Like, we need to make it explicit that we're speculating here. We don't want to just say that that's true, right? Similar to like when you like something, like, you know, you think that's you really like that movie, so that you think now that it is objectively a good movie, and so you might say like, oh, this is definitely a good movie, but then you hear someone say they didn't like it, and now you have to like defend the. You don't want to be in a position where you feel like you have to defend the ontological truth that it was a good movie. The only way to fix this right here is like, hey, I enjoyed it and you didn't enjoy it. There's nothing really much more to it. All right. It's important that we edge. Hell yeah. Yovko. That's what we've been getting at all night. That was the major point of the stream. All right, major difference between us, but it is what it is. Yep, fair enough. I mean, yeah, a lot of the stuff I try to talk about on this channel, and like the main thing I'm going to try to talk about is linguistic norms. That's really that's the main. I don't know. That's the main battleground as far as I could see it. I think all of semantics is coming from linguistic norms. And, you know, it might sound simplistic to say like, oh, it's just linguistic norms. This is just how we can talk about things. But how we talk about things is how we understand them to be true. That's why when I'm asking about this stuff, I want to know how we're allowed to talk about this topic, because that is what I can believe. Like, that's what I can actually commit to. If I'm allowed to say it, then I'm allowed to believe it. And then that starts becoming true as far as my mind is concerned. You know, I will take it as semantically true. Yo, be Jesus, welcome. But notice my language. I just said I notice and observe things. Right. That's all. You know, if that's all we do, then we're good. And it is reasonable. Yeah, I think I forget what I first said, but no, I said keep an eye on, or I said make sure to, I don't know, to be aware of the possibility of the speculation is basically it. Yo, what is up, my fellow Who man? I don't know. Oh, nice, a Who man. Yeah, we are Who mans together. What is good? Welcome to the channel. We're casually learning about complex neuroscience. I can be passing the Turing test. You would never know, right? Right? You could be one of those bots lurking amongst us. We'll never know, but as long as it's, you know, I don't think I'm allowed to say that I want bots on my channel, right? I as far as Twitch and YouTube are concerned, I do not want any bots. But if you happen to be, you know, built mechanically and you want to chill here, then feel free. Okay. At least I'm not in your walls. I guess that's better. I guess that's better. Oh, what if I become a cyborg? Can I expect discrimination here? No. I think that's like, this is pointing out a really real question that we're about to experience in, like, I don't know, 5 years, where we start considering robot rights when people don't understand enough about consciousness to know whether or not some robot that looks and behaves exactly like a human is conscious or not. And I think there are going to be a lot of people that are going to push for that type of those rights. I'm at the point where if we don't actually know, then how are we supposed to, like, yeah, like, we're going to have to show proof of biology at some point. But then what's going to be really crazy is if and when robots can emulate our physiology. And so, like, we're using artificial bodies, but like digital brains. I don't know. And but at that point, like, I don't know what's going on anymore. You know, once this becomes that much of an issue, I think we're in another world. Well, it's a ship of Theseus situation, right? How much of cyborg do you become? Yeah, I mean, that being said, you could probably replace every part of your body except for your brain and spinal cord, and you'd be basically the same, I think, given what we know about consciousness. No, that's not true, right? No, you need to leverage your body, but if you could somehow get rid of your body and then still emulate those bottom up signals, then you would be able to still be conscious in that same way. The Grok chip, I'd be skeptical about that one. How much of cyborg do you become? Being offended is a very human thing. That's the test. You wouldn't ask someone what percent race they are. You don't know me. This is like that Robin Williams movie in reverse, the robot that slowly is replaced to a full human, if I remember the movie. I don't think I saw the movie, but that sounds like a good flick. Yep, a lot of questions coming down the pipeline that we're probably not prepared for, but we'll figure it out. The bicentennial man. All right, I gotta finish this up. I gotta ask these questions, and then we gotta get out of here. I think I was gonna get off 30 minutes ago. All right, we've got all this stuff. The principles seem pervasive. Okay, and then I asked that pervasive question. Right. Okay, that was like kind of a final question. That would be nice. Is feature detection just prediction error? Would it be apt to think of even feature detection as some sort of prediction error? Yes, this is a... Okay, gotta skip the glaze. In strict predictive processing terms, if a vertical line detector in V1 fires, it is saying I'm shouting because the layers above me failed to predict this vertical line. If the layers above had predicted the vertical line, they would have sent an inhibitory signal down to explain away, cancel out the input. The line detector would stay silent. Therefore, in this framework, all sensory neural activity is a report of failure. It is a report that the internal model has not yet fully explained the energy hitting the retina. Seeing is the process of the brain trying to shut up the error signals. All right. This was in response to... I guess questions that was this specifically the question about consciousness as a model, as a authoritative model, and right. Does the global workspace actually have some sort of significance or priority when thinking about error in that way? Okay, significance in global workspace. The global workspace likely prioritizes high precision prediction errors. Right, it doesn't care about noise. Yeah, when I said that, I guess, I mean, it has priority in the sense that it influences all these local networks in such a way that it would significantly affect what counts as error, which then results in what actually can become conscious again. It cares about news. Things that are reliable but unpredicted. These are the things that force the all hands meeting to update. Okay, so let's just run that, and then I might bounce. Does AI have Pinocchio? Right? Ooh, banger movie. Yeah, that's a very Jordan Peterson movie too. Does AI have Pinocchio rights? Oh, Pinocchio rights. Did Pinocchio have full rights, or was he kind of... I mean, I feel like... No, I'm just thinking of the... Was it Del Toro? Is that the guy's name? That Pinocchio? And it seemed like Pinocchio had rights, but he was just kind of a nuisance. Maybe. All right. This is pretty long, so maybe we just call it. Now let's read this one last one. One more. All right, you are asking questions that are currently being fought over in journals like Neuron and Nature Neuroscience. Here's the breakdown of the mechanism, the debate, and the implications. Right. EEG, brainwaves, and windows of opportunity. When I say phase transition, I'm referring to the more excitable state that neurons reach following brainwaves. Is this apt? It is apt, but technically we call this oscillatory phase amplitude coupling or excitability cycles rather than phase transitions, which usually refers to criticality/physics. Right, this is just a per neuron phase transition, not a phase transition across the brain. The mechanism, brainwaves like alpha or gamma oscillations are essentially rhythmic fluctuations in voltage of the extracellular space. Imagine the oscillation as a wave. At the trough of the wave, the neuron's membrane is hyperpolarized, harder to fire. At the peak, it is depolarized, closer to fire threshold. To firing threshold. Okay, connection to burst. The oscillation coordinates the handshake. If the top-down prediction arrives during the inhibitory trough of the alpha wave, the dendrite ignores it. If it arrives at the excitatory peak, the dendrite is primed and the burst is much more likely. Okay, that makes sense. An EEG shows the synchronization of these windows. It is the traffic light system of the brain, ensuring that top-down and bottom-up signals arrive at the intersection at the exact time. All right, how do neurons differentiate generic bursts from specific content? I say, how do the predictive signals in the neuron differentiate themselves? What is the actual mechanism for pattern matching? Spatial and synaptic is not a generic hum of electricity. It is a specific key entering a specific lock. The dendrite is a keyboard. The apical dendrite has thousands of spines, right? Pattern matching prediction targets a specific cluster of spines on branch X. And this other expectation, we can imagine some other set of of branches. If the top-down signal hits branch X, it locally depolarizes only that branch. The burst only happens if the bottom-up signal also corresponds to the network connected to branch X. Okay, what I was... for the neurons differentiating, I was specifically looking at how the back propagation knows to in parentheses knows to reach branch X or Y. Like, what is the mechanism that affects whether it hits that branch, or is it, or does it propagate in all directions along the axon? I'm sorry, the dendrites. Okay, is this where you would say that it's multiple dendrites that are branching off from where this is happening? Or I feel like it's like a tree where branches could then branch off. So then at the trunk, how do you know which branch? If this was a tree graph, I would imagine that the axon hillock is the trunk. In which case, how does the back propagation know which specific branch to go down, or does it go down all of them? That was the first question I asked. I just asked it again in a more specific way because LLMs don't always know what you're saying, just like people. It is a coincidence detection logic. The neuron doesn't just ask, is there a prediction? It asks, is the specific pattern of synaptic inputs on my tuft matched by the pattern? Right, so this is insinuating that it doesn't just go down all of them, but I'm curious what the mechanism is there. View A versus view B. So error versus match. The resolution, which of the two has more evidence currently? Could it be the case that both of these are actually valid in different types of neurons? The consensus is moving toward different neurons do different things. The evidence for error. We have found specific mismatched neurons in the visual cortex that only fire when expectation is violated. For example, in mice running through VR simulations. For view B, we have found that layer 5 pyramidal neurons, Larcom's focus, tend to burst when inputs align. The synthesis, canonical microcircuit. The leading theory now is that the cortex is split by layers. Layer 2, 3, superficial, likely calculate prediction error. They send this news forward to higher areas. Layer 5, deep, likely calculate the updated belief match. They send this consensus down to the body motor systems and feedback to the lower layers. Man, just when you didn't think it was complex enough. Why this makes sense. You need to send the error up to learn, but you need to send the interpretation down to act. You don't tell your hand to move based on an error. You tell it to move based on the plan, the successful prediction. All right, implications. How to talk about it. How should we talk about predictive processing? Can we point out the ontological priority of our top-down models? You have permission to be bold here. The philosophical implications are robust. Ontological priority, the interface theory. Yes, you can state that we perceive the model, not the world. We do not see reality. We see our brain's best guess of what is useful. The world is the latent cause of our experience, but the experience itself is entirely constructed by top-down priors. Active inference, action as prediction. This is the most powerful implication you haven't explicitly leveraged yet. Right, this is like the embodied cognition stuff. Concept, we don't just predict sensory input passively. We move our bodies to fulfill predictions. Example, I don't just predict my hand will grasp the cup. I predict my hand is grasping the cup, even though it isn't yet. And this generates a prediction error, proprioceptive mismatch, or proprioceptive mismatch. To resolve the error, my reflexes contract the muscles until the hand actually grasps the cup. Implication, desire is just a prediction you haven't made true yet. Okay. The now is a construct. Oh boy. Because of transmission delays, it takes time for light to hit the retina and reach the cortex. If we processed only bottom-up data, we would live 100 milliseconds in the past. Okay. Predictive processing allows us to perceive real time by compensating for the lag. We are effectively living in a predicted present. Okay, so this is where I was trying to get at, where this is perfectly in line with Heidegger's phenomenological observations. That we are fundamentally future-oriented, and that anything we understand to be true presently is in some way in the past, in this same sense. And when he talks about the present in this way, this inauthentic mode of being, he's talking about our current understanding of the future, the past, and the present, all operating in that space. But we're constantly oriented towards possibility. So I guess, yeah, when we haven't really covered that part of that, because we've talked about predictions or prediction error, but we haven't talked about how, like, where would possibility come from? And the tricky thing is, possibility might only be cognized by us. Like that, it might be something that we only conceptualize or theorize. But the idea of potential, no, you know what? Potential actually occurs in the brain, but I don't know if it's conscious, right? You could think of potential as these competing signals before they ignite and reach the global workspace, which becomes conscious to us. But then that wouldn't be phenomenological in the way that Heidegger would point out. So is there something about maybe the signals that compete, that make it to the workspace, that still are technically in competition with other signals in the workspace? It's competing for your attention. So you can imagine that perhaps we are conscious of many different possibilities occurring rapidly, and we aren't like clearly conscious of them until, like, obviously we put our attention on one and reflect on this one possibility that we end up coming up with. So that we would have to do a little more research into before we start making a real, Heidegger video essay. Psychopathology as prior dysregulation. This framework offers a non-stigmatizing way to talk about mental health, anxiety, overly precise priors about negative outcomes, ignoring safety cues. Schizophrenia and hallucinations are caused by assigning too much precision, reality, to internal top-down predictions and ignoring bottom-up sensory constraints. And then autism, assigning too much precision to bottom-up sensory errors. Everything is surprising / overwhelming, leading to a failure to form generalized top-down models. All right, summary for your writing mechanism. It is dendritic coincidence detection on layer 5 neurons and likely error calculation on layer 2 to 3 neurons. The Y, this allows the brain to be bandwidth efficient. All right, I think I'm done all questions except for this one, so let's just run it and then call it a stream at almost 3 hours. And then maybe on Wednesday we just say like, hey, can you summarize everything, or not summarize, but can you can you provide a comprehensive and extensive summary of everything we've discussed up until this point in the direction that you think it would make sense to explain it in? This is a crucial mechanistic distinction. Your intuition about the routing problem is logical. If the signal goes everywhere, how do we keep the computation specific? The short answer is the axon hillock does not route the signal, it broadcasts it. Here is the correction to the mental model, which explains how the specificity is achieved despite the lack of routing. The broadcast, no routing. When the somatic action potential fires, the back propagation travels up the dendritic trunk like a shockwave. It goes everywhere. Initially, it propagates into all major branches. It does not have a destination address like an IP packet. Right. It fades, attenuation. As the back propagation travels farther from the soma and splits into thinner branches, the signal naturally gets weaker, attenuates. By the time it reaches the distal tips, it is often too weak to do anything on its own. The gating mechanism, receiver side logic. Since the soma screams at everyone, the specificity is determined by the branches, not the soma. This is the active dendrite hypothesis. Think of the back propagation as a key that is being sent to every door in the house. Inactive branches, locked doors. If a dendrite branch has not received recent top-down input, it arrives, finds the door locked, and dies out. Nothing happens. If a specific branch has just received top-down input, that input causes a local depolarization, a small voltage change. Okay. And then this goes back up. So, okay, what I'm getting at is that it just needs to match. And this makes sense with what we just discussed about, or just discussed. This has to be just matching. In that case, and as we just discussed, with L5 pyramidal neurons, this must be matching rather than some sort of error, unless, of course, we assume that the signal, that the top-down signals are already error. No, what am I trying to say here? Oh. Unless, of course, we assume that the top-down signals are predicting our priors about error rather than priors about the bottom-up signals. Okay, what I'm missing, though, is... Wouldn't this just make it such that any prior could cause this reaction? In this case, couldn't any prior cause the calcium release, which effectively just propagates the prior / prediction? This, to me, Unless I'm misunderstanding something. The system seems to be bottom-up signals cause the action potentials, but regardless of what the priors are, those action potentials involving back propagation will cause those priors to effectively take over and affect rapid bursts of the prior signal. Right? The priors. In that case, this must be matching rather than some sort. Well, yeah, where's the matching involved? Where is the matching involved? Yeah, I must be missing one piece of this. And perhaps I should have just kept reading here. Okay, if a specific branch has just received top-down input, that input causes a local depolarization. This local voltage change inactivates A-type potassium channels. Potassium channels usually act as brakes or bouncers that dampen electrical signals. When the top-down input turns these bouncers off, the branch becomes superconductive. When the global back propagation shockwave hits that specific prime branch, it doesn't die out. Instead, it rides the local depolarization, enters the branch, and triggers the calcium spike. Right. But yeah, this would privilege the prior signal completely. I don't know what the match is. It's a coincidence detector. If the soma directed the signal, the neuron would need a map of its own tree stored in the soma. It doesn't have that, right? By using global broadcast local gating, the neuron allows independent branches to vote on whether the current sensory event matches their specific prediction. Ooh, okay. By using a global broadcast plus local gating, the neuron allows independent branches to vote on whether the current sensory event matches their specific prediction. So is matching basically just going to cause a stronger prior? Okay, I'm going to ask that. Is it just the case that matching involves stronger priors, and we must look to the broader context to make sense of what exactly is being matched? All right, we're getting close to 3 hours. I just want to shore this up, and then I want to call it quits. You've hit on the precise reason why matching is structural, not just functional. Your concern is if the back propagating action potential floods the tree, won't it just amplify whatever prior happens to be hanging around? The answer is yes, but with a critical constraint. The prior and the sensory input must be wired to the same neuron. Must be wired to the same neuron. What does that mean? Right, it is the same neuron. That's dendrites are for one neuron. The matching doesn't happen because the neuron decides the signals are similar. The matching happens because connectivity restricts the neuron to only receive matching signals. I see. So I think it is that case. It is the case that we just assume that whatever is being predicted here is in alignment with what is what's happening bottom up. And if they're not, then we won't get this chain reaction. So here is the breakdown of why a mismatch doesn't cause a burst. The wiring constraint, the two key system, imagine two neurons, neuron V, neuron H. The match, prediction equals vertical, reality equals vertical. Top down, the brain predicts a vertical line. It sends a predictive signal specifically to the apical dendrites of neuron V. Neuron V is now primed. Bottom up, the eye sees a vertical line. It sends a sensory signal to the soma of neuron V. Neuron V fires a spike. The back propagation shoots up. It hits the primed dendrite. Burst. Yes, vertical line. But if there's a mismatch, then we're going to get that same bottom-up signal, but the top-down, because it's predicting a horizontal line, it's not sending anything to the vertical neuron V, and so the back propagation reaches the top of neuron V. There's no prior there. Prior went to neuron H. So the back propagation finds locked doors, no depolarization, it dies out. So the result, single spike. The system reports, I saw a vertical line, but I wasn't expecting it. Okay, neuron H has the prior, prime top, but it gets no bottom-up input because the line was vertical. The soma never fires. The prior sits and fades away. Result, silence. So what is matching? Matching is anatomical co-activation. Matching is simply the physical event where the neuron that represents feature X receives both the sensory evidence for X and the prediction for X at the same time. Okay. And obviously this gets super complex. And what X would be, you know, could be not even just things that we know or like concepts that we can think about, but imagine like, you know, 1/100th of a concept that we're thinking about. It's contributing that little bit, but it, you know, the predictions line up here. Okay. Yo, Birdbanes, hello. Welcome to the channel. A bunch of new viewers. Nice. We're on the come up. That's what we've been saying for the last year and a half. Asking AI why we perceive optical illusions. Not quite. The goal of this stream was figuring out how like fundamental this idea of predictive processing is for how we understand brain processes. And that led us to, oh, do I have like a exclamation point document? Is that in the thing? No, unfortunate. I gotta make that. That's a good idea. Document. What are those called? Command? Oh, should it be exclamation point doc? I should make them both. We're pros here. Let's just make them both. All right. Yeah, we're just trying to understand the brain more. We're always usually like trying to figure out stuff with the brain for reasons of both philosophy and also to help us out. You know, a lot of these things have practical implications that help us regulate emotions or figure out how to orient ourselves towards goals. Like that's a huge deal. And yeah, we're trying to work on all that stuff just for fun. We saw the implications of everything that we've been talking about. You can state that we perceive the model, not the world. This is like, you know, along the lines of predictive processing, which is our contemporary leading interpretation for the brain right now. We do not see reality. We see our brain's best guess of what is useful. The world is the latent cause of our experience, but the experience itself is entirely constructed by top-down priors. So we're constrained by these physical signals that are constantly affecting our processing, but it's the top-down model that is actually affecting, like, most fundamentally affecting our conscious experience, which is why it's really important, like, what we understand, that affects what we see and what we think is possible. And the way that we can also think about this, a couple weeks ago we read the chapter in the 7.5 lessons of the brain that talked about how, like, when we're born, we start with all these neurons. We start with so many neurons. We start with so many connections. Actually, I don't know if we start with a bunch of connections. We start with a bunch of neurons, right? Do we start with the connections? I think we start with connections, and then connections die off. So, like, our learning, our development is actually one of pruning away. So you can imagine that we're not actually set up to experience things like we do currently. Like, we talked about how, like, babies don't, like, see the world like we see the world. They haven't differentiated these signals well enough, or enough in general, to see the types of things that we see, or to think, like, oh, that's a face, obviously. So, like, when they're staring at a face, like, they don't see a face like we see faces. They have to learn, like, what a face is. They have to learn how to do all these things. And what, like, the stuff that we're learning affects how we end up perceiving the world. Obviously, this stuff can change. Our brain's still plastic when we're adults, but yeah, the concept stands. I do wonder if regulating emotions is the same as suppressing them. That's a good question, and I would say yes and no. It, like, in two different ranges of time, you could say, two different scopes of time. Because effectively, what you want to have happen is parts of the brain to inhibit the emotion centers. So in that sense, yes, you want to suppress them. But that doesn't mean we suppress them in the way that, like, when we think about suppressing emotions by not tending to them, it doesn't mean that. Like, it seems very clear that our science tells us that tending to emotions, or tending to the reasons why we might be experiencing the emotions, is really fundamental for actually affecting the type of inhibition that we would like in the future, which is, the brain suppressing them, not us suppressing. We don't want to suppress them. We want the brain to suppress them, if that makes any sense. All right. What do we get at the end here? All right, so we went through all this stuff. We went through this. So what is matching? We went through that. Does the prior take over? Yes. This is a way to phrase it. The neuron fires a standard report normally. This is just the raw data mode. But with the match, the neuron switches modes. The burst effectively allows the context prior to take over the signal. Okay, so the question would be, is it the case that the prior is slightly different than the bottom-up signal, such that there might be more or less information that ends up becoming the bursts. That's not the best way to phrase that. That ends up in the bursts. I mean, it is the bursts that ends up bursting. That ends up rapid bursting. Okay. The neuron switches modes. The burst effectively allows the context, the prior, to take over the signal. The burst tells the downstream network, don't just treat this as raw data, treat this as confirmed reality. Wow. This is why we say the burst broadcasts the posterior, the updated belief. It is the prior saying, I was right, and here is the high volume confirmation. In that sense, perhaps there are still what would be the way to say that? I was going to say there might be some change involved, some error, quote unquote, involved, but not for that one neuron, because that's the prior for that neuron, but maybe it could incorporate some sort of extra information in the broader system. I know that's pretty out there though. Wasn't aware AI are well versed in neurobiology. AI is actually quite phenomenal at this stuff. There's stuff that AI is not good at, but something like neuroscience, where it's like well documented and it's kind of got like a clear science to it, like literally a clear science, like that'll show up. But we do have to be careful about this stuff, and it also helps that I'm trying to read a bunch of other stuff on the side, and I'm able to piece things together from all these things, and it helps that I'm asking these questions in somewhat comprehensible ways, and yeah, if we find that something's wrong, we have to iron that out. Gotta go grab lunch. Have a good one. Yeah, enjoy the lunch. Hope to see you back at some point. We talk about a bunch of different random stuff. Feel free to bring a topic too. All right. Summary. Okay. And then let's get this guy in there. And then we can leave. Then we can call it a day. Oh my gosh, 10:22. Yeesh. Information fusion. Okay, one of the most important functional aspects of the system, the top-down signal and the bottom-up signal are rarely identical mirrors of each other. They contain different types of information. The match is not a checksum, checking if two files are identical. It is a handshake between abstract and concrete. Here is how the information difference drives the burst and leads to pattern completion. The information asymmetry, bottom-up. The signal is high resolution, noisy, and specific. It contains the pixels, so edges, contrast, specific retinal coordinates. It lacks meaning. The top-down, the gist, this signal is low resolution, compressed and abstract. It contains the concept, for example, face, threat, mother. It lacks pixels, right? And this is just for the level 5 pyramidal neurons. So we have to keep that in mind. Like these are the high level frontal cortex neurons. The interaction, the top-down signal doesn't say pixel at this. It says, I expect a red shape here. The burst happens when the concrete details, bottom up, fall within the broad scope, top-down, of the prediction. All right, pattern completion. Right, you asked if the takes over. This is most evident when the bottom-up signal is incomplete. Okay, I see. And then it can fill the gap. More or less information. Does the amount of information matter? Yes. Low info. If you are in a foggy room, your top-down priors are flat, uncertain. The depolarization in the dendrites is weak. You rely almost entirely on bottom-up spikes. You don't burst much. You experience the world as grainy or unsure. Strong prior, high info. If you're looking at a familiar face, your top-down priors are massive and specific. They strongly depolarize the dendrites. Even a faint bottom-up signal, a quick glimpse, will trigger a massive burst. So when we talk about all this stuff, I just, I want to just make this clear because this is like my perspective. Like when we see so many of these clear connections between our experience of the world, our own phenomenological experience of consciousness, and these highly specific, evidenced, empirical mechanisms, Like, to me, that shows that we have like a good grasp of a lot of the different interworkings of consciousness. Obviously, we don't have everything figured out, but it gives us so much more weight, so much more reason to speculate that our conscious experience is arising from these mechanisms, from these as in like the broader than what we already know, like just physical mechanisms. Like we don't, in this case, we don't need the extra, any extra things. I mean, we're not saying that extra things can't happen, right? We should be open for anything provided it can pass the empirical science test. But yeah, like we can explain all these different aspects of experience that we are really looking for. We're looking for what makes us feel meaningful lives. We're making what causes us to experience the world in these really weird ways. We're looking for how we think about things and how our thoughts about things change. And obviously, this is this type of science is at a infancy right now. But it's so promising that I think that we should be screaming about it. Like, I think we should be on the top of our roof, like cheering out, like, hey guys, we got this really cool thing. All right. I think I'm going to call it there. And then maybe we'll read off like a summary during the next stream, and then we can go to the next topic. Wednesday was also supposed to be the State of the Union day of the week, so we'll see if I do that as well. And then maybe we can continue watching some of these. My apologies, we didn't get to the does consciousness defeat materialism? I guess we also don't want to spend too much time in consciousness space. I know I just spent like all day, but we do want to get back to part 2 stuff soon. I think this was really important for me because I've been using predictive processing a lot, and I want to make sure that we are using it in the proper way. So, all right, thank you all for chilling. Thank you for all the newcomers. Thanks for saying hi, and yeah, have a good rest of the day, everyone. See you later.